Good evening, comrades. Thanks for joining us. Tonight, we're looking in our series on imperialism, we're looking at the role of the BRICS countries. The name is based on the 5 major emerging economies: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They've just been joined by Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the United Arab Emirates. Another 40 or so countries have also expressed an interest in following suit, including Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Malaysia. It's estimated that by 2050 that the BRICS countries could produce 40% of the global economic output. So it's important that we do take them seriously. And nothing lasts forever, of course, including UK and US imperialism. But can a collection of countries which seem to have very little in common really take on US imperialism? Or is it mainly one country, China, calling all the shots? Will that increase that tension? Will that change? We also want to discuss if we, the working class, should indeed celebrate the BRICS countries, as George Galloway has done from the summit in Kazan. He's, of course, joined by many others on the left who often end up supporting a small butcher with a larger one, because that seems less terrible, perhaps. Here to discuss these issues in more detail is Yassamine Mather, critique acting editor and a contributor to The Weekly Worker. Thanks for joining us, Yassamine.
Thanks very much, Tina. Please let me know if I'm going on for too long, so I stop, okay? I think I want to start by some of the, if you like, highlights of BRICS, and definitely the setting up of the new development bank, in addition to what Tina said in the introduction, in 2014 was of great importance. The new development bank funded the infrastructure and the development projects that the BRICS countries and the emerging economies were going to follow. The countries that are keen to join BRICS want to do so in a way as an alternative to a world completely dominated by the United States, by Western governments. And that is the, if you like, lure, the attraction of BRICS. They want to, in a way, find an alternative or a counterbalance to organizations like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and so on. However, I don't think we can talk of the BRICS without referring to China's role. Currently, probably the second largest economy, but its rate of progress, or progress in quotation marks, is very fast. And the expectation is that within a couple of decades, we will see it overtaking the United States. The trade, the investment, the economic strengths of BRICS relies very heavily on China. If you look at the way these countries trade with each other or exchange technology, exchange finance, income, it really isn't that much. All we are looking at is China's relations with all of these countries. And I will try and look at some of these details. But central to this is what many people have talked about before, and that's the Belt and Road initiatives that China, under the current president Xi, started. This was to create an infrastructure mainly in Asia, Africa, to a lesser extent in Europe, with the aim of trade and development of infrastructure. And of course, all this sounds very good. Who is against development? Who is against boosting trade? When you're facing hegemon power like the US that dominates the world and often penalizes its opponents with political opponents, with sanctions, with dissing them and so on. Having said that, I think it would be easy to see that China is not the benevolent, if you like, funder of all these. Very often people have talked about the debt traps that the participating countries in the Belt and Road Initiative end up in terms of what they owe to China, but also the long-term economic dependence that they will have on the Chinese government. So when you talk to Chinese Communist Party people, Chinese academics who defend China, European and Western and US academics who defend China, they would tell you that this is a question of cooperation, a question of mutual benefit, that in Africa, in Southeast Asia, this is not a new form of exploitation. They have no imperialist or colonial ambitions. And it is true that in terms of what one would refer to as historic, traditional colonies, military conquest, land conquest, control of various countries, and indeed control of the politics within dominated countries, China is taking a very different look. But one could argue that in the 21st century, you have to come up with new forms of imperialism. You couldn't, there is no reason in many ways in a global world where finance, capital, trade is playing such an important role. There is no need for land conquest or imposing troops in various parts of Africa, Asia, in order to economically and politically dominate the existing order. Let's call it at this stage the existing order. There are many Marxists who argue that China's policy is a true example of economic imperialism. I am paying a lot of attention to China because, as I will explain, China's role is pivotal regarding BRICS, and we'll talk about interrelations between the BRICS countries a bit later. So I don't think anyone in their right mind would say China is anti-imperialist. The arguments put forward is whether it's proto-imperialist or a fully developed economic, but an imperialist country. There are those who would say, no, it's part of the peripheral global capitalist system, and all it's doing is using its economic power to shape the world in its own image. I think that's difficult if you look at the details of how China relates to economic countries in various countries, to the economics of various countries. But of course, that is an argument put forward. In many ways, not only is it a growing economy, but it's becoming one of the largest economies of the world. And its purchasing power is unrivaled. Most importantly, while the West envies or talks or hopes to achieve something like 0.1, 0.22% economic growth. China finds 4 to 6% economic growth as a disappointment. So you can see where they are and where the rest of the world is. However, you can't deny that in its relations with African countries in particular, but also other developing countries, in desperate need for cheap energy, in desperate need for good price raw materials from these developing countries, it has no alternative but in some ways entering deals in which the developing country is not the beneficiary. Let's put it as mildly as that. I would say the developing country is exploited, but let's assume we would say it's not in an equal par. There are those who would argue, and amongst them are many Marxists, many left-wing groups, who argue using who are not used, who use Lenin's theory of imperialism, and their argument is that China has turned into a capitalist imperialist state. I think there is no doubt that monopoly capital and its aggressive push into global markets reflects China's current position in terms of what it is in monopoly capital. With the Belt and Road Initiative, we can see China investing in infrastructure. It extracts raw materials, and extracting raw materials is a basic definition of what one calls neocolonial, although obviously there are differences in the way China does this as opposed to the old colonial powers. At the same time, one could argue that China offers better deals to developing countries than the IMF and the World Bank. For example, the interest rates that I've followed are often lower when China gives loans. There are better investment terms, co-investment terms when it is dealing with these countries. However, those of us who are old enough remember that, or who I wasn't looking at politics in the 1940s or the 1950s, but I do remember from the 1960s and the 1970s that many people talked of the decades 40s, 50s, early 60s as a period where the US, as a rising imperialist power, was offering much better development deals to third world countries. In the case of Iran, the United States was offering electrification. It was encouraging the then dictator, the Shah, to set up a planning organization for development. And all this was very much in contrast to the old colonial powers, such as Britain, who were for 100% exploitation. So China's better rates reflect the rising power of a country that has ambitions, in my opinion, to become the hegemon capitalist power and isn't at the moment. There are those who talk about who critique this view of Chinese imperialism, they say China sends more surplus value, which basically means what you profit from labor and production to the US and West than what it takes from developing countries. And therefore, this shows China's integration into global value chains. And as a result of this, these defenders of China, some of them in monthly review, but not limited to monthly review, would argue that as a result of this, basically China is not an imperialist, capitalist imperialist power, but a semi-peripheral country in the global capitalist system. I think China would not accept this definition itself, but most importantly, I don't think that that reflects reality. There are those who, I'm not going into the debate about Lenin's theory of imperialism, but there are those who look at the classic definition of imperialism in the book, Lenin's book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, and find places where China doesn't fit. There are those of us who have always had difficulty with that book. We accept the importance of the book, but the book was very much written for a specific period, the First World War, and shouldn't be taken as gospel, shouldn't be taken as the Bible that will forever be correct. And the reality is that, of course, the world has changed. We are no longer talking of a colonial division where there has been national liberation movements in the 20th century. There's been decolonization. Many of the former colonies are independent. So you can't just use those definitions in the 21st century and try and find an exact parallel between those and say, I can't tick number 6 or number 7 of Lenin's definition, and therefore China is not an imperialist country. I find these arguments quite redundant, to be honest. Marxists who argue that China has become a monopolist capitalist economy inside its own borders, and that that by exporting capital abroad, it has become, in a way, a form of imperialist, maybe not in the traditional sense, but at least a proto-imperialist country, have, in my opinion, more a better reflection of where we are in terms of its current political and economic definition. Now, China's economic dependence is really the main reason why the BRICS have obtained any credibility. Here you have especially to look at the new members. Let's take Iran away. This is not a political alliance, contrary to what some deluded people on the left argue, of the axis of resistance. You can't have countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE, who are net creditors with strong economies, to be on the same par with Ethiopia and Egypt, who face very huge debts, and think that this is, if you like, a homogeneous political alliance. But most importantly, politically, when you have Saudi Arabia and UAE, you are talking of a divergence of view. I can understand why Saudi Arabia and UAE have joined countries such as Iran or Ethiopia or some of the African countries in terms of political influence of China. and join BRICS. But remember that Saudi Arabia is doing this, or UAE is not in BRICS because it suddenly decided to become anti-imperial. It's using it as a leverage against the United States. So it can point out to BRICS. It can occasionally, such as after the events in Gaza, show a little bit, and not much, but a little bit of independence from the United States foreign policy, completely dominated by a pro-Israeli position, only because in those circumstances, BRICS gives it a lifeline, a separate lifeline from defending entirely the US. And it's a reflection. I think the position of countries such as Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates is a reflection of the changing world we live, where Mohammed bin Salman or the UAE emir haven't suddenly become anti-imperialist. They are seeing the changes in global capitalism and securing their position in the world. The BRICS have been pushing for changes in global institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, and in those terms, they do try and, if you like, act as a reformist rather than a challenge completely to these organizations. Why? Because if you look at all of the countries within this framework, including Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, India, and to a lesser extent, China itself, they are not independent of these global institutions, and therefore their position towards these organizations is more looking for more transparency in terms of trade rules, better rates in terms of loans, but not a challenge to the institutions of global capital itself. When we look at the 5 regional BRICS, and that's quite important, I think China played a very significant role. It was a key partner for both the more wealthy of these countries, but also the lower income countries. For Brazil, it was the agricultural and mineral exports to China that gave it a better economic situation. For Russia, it was energy exports. And for South Africa, it was the mineral exports, all of them to China. As time went on, we'll come back to the relations and trades between these countries, but I want to also talk here briefly about currency. So as time went on, and especially as sanctions left Russia and later Iran, which is a new member of BRICS, into a severe economic difficulties, the whole issue of currency dependency, in particular to the dollar, to a far lesser extent to euro, but mainly to dollar, and the global dominance of dollar in terms of world currency encouraged all of these countries, with the support and of course with the backing of China, to look at both yuan and the gold. Russia increased, yuan is the Chinese currency, as you know, so Russia increased its yuan reserves and shifted or tried to shift from a dollar-based trade to ruble yuan transactions. And you can see that sometime between February and October 2022, the trade between the two currencies became 80-fold. The rate changed that much. All of this creates benefits for China and more vulnerability for Russia. Because at the end of the day, it is China as the stronger economic power that controls the exchange rate between the yuan and the ruble. So when the ruble goes down 80-fold, it's the Chinese who benefit. Chinese goods become very expensive for Russia, while import of fuel, raw materials, whatever it does import from Russia becomes much cheaper. Of course, what can happen in the long term is that the United States, in its own economic relations with China, might change that relation and put pressure on China in terms of the way it has so far supported sanctions against Russia, but we will have to see that. The other way in which some of these countries facing sanctions, including Russia, but also Iran, have tried to resist the US dominance and the currency dominance of the dollar is to invest in gold. And again, that has its own challenges. The difficulties of buying and selling large amounts of gold have their own problems. There is the issue of smuggling, black market, changing the origin of the gold, and so on. So all of this hasn't been that easy. As a result, yuanization, i.e., using the yuan as the main currency, is far more attractive for countries such as Russia, especially as they face serious economic difficulties caused by US sanctions. One thing that we have to consider is China's relationship with the Gulf states, the Persian Gulf states. In particular, I will leave Iran to the last because I will talk about that later. But when you look at Saudi Arabia and the UAE, it's the energy, it's the fact that China can buy cheap oil from the Middle East that is so significant. And contrary to what we were facing, say, in the 20th century, the US policy towards many of these countries is not an issue of cheap oil. It's more an issue of stopping cheap oil to China. That's the dominant, if you like, mindset for the people who are involved in such arguments. So that's a very big win for China. It has secured between some of the major oil producers in the Persian Gulf, including Iran, Saudi Arabia, UAE, to a lesser extent Qatar. It has secured long-term cheap oil for its industry, for its production. What we have is Sorry, Tina, is it possible not to have the text popping out? It's very difficult for me to concentrate, especially with the comments coming over my screen.
Okay.
Yeah, the chat seems to come out on my screen. Sorry, I'm not looking at chat, but it's kind of over dominates what I'm trying.
Oh, sorry, I don't know how that
No,
happened.
that's okay. Maybe it's my fault. Okay. The advantage for these countries is what they can get from China that they can't get from the West. So the West has become extremely protective when it comes to renewable energy, when it comes to artificial intelligence, when it comes to advanced drone technology and so on. China, at least on the paper, and I assume in reality, is far more generous when it comes to sharing artificial intelligence. For example, China has no limitations in, or at least has on paper, has no limitation in sharing what it knows about processors, new GPUs, graphical processor units, and so on, aspects that are very protected in the West. The EU, UK, US try and restrict access to these technologies to most third world countries, and China seems to take a completely different approach to that. And as a result of this, it does make the relationship more attractive in some way. So you can see why, for example, Mohammed bin Salman, who historically, traditionally should be completely on the side of US, is trying to hedge his bets by being on both sides of the divide. In this way, we have to admit that in this, what I would call a uni-global world, because many people talk of multi-imperialist powers, competition between these imperialist powers, the fact that these imperialist powers, the smaller sub-imperialist powers, Harvey talks about that, will weaken the US. I don't think we see this. At least at the moment, we are not seeing a weakness or a division. Any capitalist country can and has imperialist trends within it and uses those. That isn't the question. The question is that, as the events of the last 14 months have shown us, one hegemon power can defend a rogue apartheid genocidal state and nobody else. The collective might of all the rest, including sub-imperialists, can't stop it. In this world, there is, if you like, a complete disparity between the current hegemon power and the rest of the world. And you can see the attraction of BRICS for countries that want to diss the United States, including Iran and the axis of resistance. However, I would argue that it would be wrong to put too much hope within such a system, because at the end of the day, you wouldn't, at the end of the day, that is a very temporary, a very short term, and the creation of very specific conjuncture in history that has allowed this to happen. It's not a long-term solution. Before I talk about the nuclear deals, Iran, Russia, China as an axis, because it is an important part of BRICS, especially now that Iran is fully associated with BRICS, I also want to argue that if you look at economic trade between these various countries, we don't see many signs of this. We don't see trade between Brazil and South Africa. We don't see much trade or economic deals or development deals between India and other countries. Every deal that we look at in BRICS, China is playing a central role in it. So all the lines ending, all the roads end in Peking rather than Rome. And that is quite significant. The other issue that challenges the BRICS in a very serious manner is the heterogeneous nature, the difference in the if you like, strengths of these various economies, their level of development, and the fact that they're not going to, there's no way you could talk of this as partnership between equals. South Africa has its own challenges. Brazil, as I said, remains very much dependent on raw materials, agriculture. India is progressing more than the others. It has, first of all, it has the numerical population advantage, but it's also making major advances in terms of information technology, and that challenges its position. We also have countries that are dependent on one product, or more or less like United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia, who have ambitions of greatness beyond their capabilities. If anyone has followed the NEOM project of Mohammed bin Salman, it was supposed to be this 500-kilometer single line that was going to be the modern world, AI dominated and so on. Nowadays, it's 120, 150 kilometers, which is much less than 500 miles. These countries are not in a position to predict their own progress, never mind their relation with a new emerging major economic power such as China. One of the key, if you like, alliances within BRICS is the Iran-Russia-China alliance. It's partly led by Iran and Russia's attempts at going around or avoiding US sanctions, punitive sanctions. And in this, they have played an important role in terms of trying to shift their deals from US dollar to Chinese yuan. And US sanctions are so severe that if you send 20 pounds, and I'm not joking, literally 20 pounds from a bank in Tehran to a bank in Europe, the account of the person who receives this, who has absolutely nothing to do with the Iranian government or the Revolutionary Guards, can be blocked for a number of years until this person proves that they are not associated with the Revolutionary Guards or Iran's so-called terrorist activities. So the sanctions are really affecting everybody's life, not just the state, not just the government. And you can imagine then a country like that where you can't sell your oil. I'm sure that's true of Russia. As soon as they spend $1, it will register in one way or another in the global trade system. In order to avoid that, you can go to doing most of your deals, as Iran's central bank has done, in yuan. And there is inevitable benefits for both sides. However, it can create its own challenges and its own frictions. When you look at Russia's relationship with both China as the dominant power and Iran as a lesser economy, this economic closeness has brought about a level of political closeness as well. So on papers they would argue they're campaigning against Western dominance, they are for state sovereignty, they are for regional autonomy, and they would then argue these liberal Western bourgeois liberal ideas don't reflect their views, and therefore they are in some kind of political alliance. Here, the situation is far more complicated. China's position on these issues is very complex. China doesn't want to lose Western allies. China has ambitions of economic deals with the European Union, especially now that Trump is in power. They see a way out of their own economic isolation in terms of US with European Union and with the United Kingdom, as we witnessed last week. The new UK government has a slightly different attitude to economic deals with China compared to the conservatives. Both Russia and China are also aware that some countries that supporting rogue states or axis of resistance, whatever you want to call it, has political benefits for them in Africa, in Asia. In fact, genocide in Gaza, the isolation of Israel, has given Russia and China a slightly improved position in this matter. Because if you look at, for example, UN votes, obviously quite a lot of, irrespective of what dictator rules them, many Asian, African countries do vote against the state of Israel, 142 of them, as far as I can remember, in various General Assembly votes. And in this way, both Russia and China can portray themselves as being part of this global South against the US hegemon power. And I would argue that it's partly because of that they take a nuanced view towards Iran's nuclear development, and it has a very complicated effect. For example, when it comes to Russia, they don't want escalation of the war in Ukraine, but they don't want a victory for Ukraine or NATO either. So China's position is much more complicated than just supporting Russia, irrespective of what it does. It does take a nuanced view. When it comes to Iran's nuclear positions, they have not been, if you like, advocates of Iran should have nuclear weapons. They do sign with every other country the IAEA positions that Iran shouldn't develop nuclear weapons, but they are less severe regarding Iran's nuclear program than, for example, France, UK, Germany, the Power 5+1, as they are called. when it comes to more China-specific alliances, such as the China Cooperation Organization, then they're much more careful. If you look at, for China, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is a very important long-term geopolitical initiative. But China has been very clear that it doesn't want SCO to appear overtly anti-Western. And as a result of this, it has kept Iran very much at a distance as an active observer, but not as a member. And that reflects, in my opinion, the long-term ambitions of China, not to become an leader of an anti-imperialist world, but more to become a major capitalist economic power, an imperialist power, even if it might not be at this particular juncture. So there is one, so we should separate what I would call the Belt and Road Initiative, which is more about joint projects, about economic development, as opposed to long-term political alliances such as the Shanghai Cooperation. One of the, if like, examples used by other countries in terms of how BRICS can help develop their country and how these better interest rates, lower interest rates, the involvement, the cooperation and involvement of experts from both countries can build this development, as opposed to how the West approaches development, which is to develop and leave and then sell expertise at very high rates. What we see here is the kind of Belt and Road Agreement dealt with that Iran and China have signed in 2021, but it hasn't actually been finalized. And the fact that it hasn't been finalized is, I would think, quite a lot to do with the fact that despite what it says, China doesn't want to commit itself to an overtly anti-US political stance. It is happy to use some of its funding, some of its economic power in terms of yuan trading, but it's not happy to openly go into a deal that will show a completely different political position. What we see here, and again, we don't know the truth. So if you look at what some of the royalists or right-wing Iranians, but also right-wing European and Western companies have said, there was first talks that Iran has actually given land to China. And you think, well, China has enough land. Why would it want to get land in the Middle East? There's no point in it. We heard about one particular island, Kish Island, being given to China within the, I think it's on the edges of the Persian Gulf, which might have strategic importance as it is close to the Straits of Hormuz and therefore can control the passage of oil tankers and so on. But I really can't believe these are I don't think in the final deal, in the provisional deals, they are nowhere to be seen. What we are looking at is provision of ports, airports, oil fields, infrastructure, what I would call infrastructure, and IT development, both in terms of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, graphical processor unit development, where China has made spectacular advances in exchange for cheaper oil. And the cheaper oil is debatable, but so far in the last 3-4 years, at the height of the sanctions by the US, China has benefited from very cheap oil from Iran. We don't know how cheap, but everyone's assumption is they're paying much less than the going rate. Now, petroleum economist claims that China has managed to guarantee a discount of 12% to the 6-month rolling price of comparable benchmark products. Now, this is the kind of things that the US is very concerned about, because for the US, the question isn't, as far as I understand, the US is no longer dependent on oil in the Middle East. What its concern is supply of cheap oil to China. And it is this kind of partnership that makes very, very dangerous for the US, because obviously if that kind of deal becomes the norm, you can see how the entire policies of the previous Trump administration continued very much by the Biden administration into isolating certain states, labeled rogue states, has actually backfired. It has backfired because rather than bankrupting those countries, it has encouraged them to get into closer relations with China. China is economically benefiting from this, but it's also politically benefiting from it, as it can count an increasing number of such countries within its own sphere of influence. And here it is a trajectory that one can see as powers, great powers diminish in terms of what they have, what they can achieve, and how great powers then increase their influence by gaining support from other countries. Whether this is where we are with BRICS, and therefore whether this is, if you like, the next period where we are going to see a strong competition between the West and China is a matter for debate. What we can say for sure is that the defeat of the Democrats and the coming to power of Trump, who has no claim to Western liberal democracy, will make this situation far more challenging, far more difficult to predict, and therefore, in many ways, will make that whole debate about BRICS far more unpredictable, as we can talk about it. The one thing I would say for sure is that the working class in Western countries, in the United States, should not have any illusion that that is the solution. And the working class in developing countries should have no illusions about this, because it is pragmatic and often short-term political interests that have created these alliances in the same, I mean, the best example is Saudi Arabia being in the same alliance as China. So those short-term alliances can change very quickly, and the loser in such situations, more than anybody else, will be those sections of the working class that have relied on such alliances for their future, for the future of revolutionary movements. That's it. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Yasmin. That was a very detailed and nuanced look at the BRICS countries, which I think is absolutely what is required. Not just because there is a lot of illusions from some quarters on the left. You mentioned that. I also mentioned George Galloway early at the beginning, talking about the BRICS as if they were some kind of, that's our horse in the race. If we want to do something about US imperialism, you need to have, you need to back the BRICS. That's the future. It might be the future. China might indeed do away with US imperialism or take over imperialism. But as you pointed out, they have no interest in anti-imperialism. China is not it might not be a fully imperialist country, but it is not an anti-imperialist country for sure. So why the working class has anything to gain from backing one want-to-be imperialist power against the existing imperialist power US is beyond me. Comrades, if anybody wants to ask a question or make a comment, please click raise hand now, and I can bring you in. Just a question then. I mean, by pointing out all these tensions, etc., and I think you outlined this, and it's an article in the Weekly Worker as well, in this week's paper, which will be up tomorrow morning, I think, or tonight. How China is actually using its position to, it looks good on the surface to give cheaper loans, etc. But what it's doing is what the US did as well. Well, not 100 years ago, but 75 years ago, when it was in the middle of taking over, giving cheap loans, tying countries to itself by investing in infrastructure, and that makes them, dependent on using Chinese companies, Chinese entities to build those infrastructure models then as well, and to tie countries to themselves by cheap loans, etc. You called it a sort of semi-colonial method. So that's an interesting aspect of it, a sort of colonial aspect, to an imperialist aspect, really. But do you think that China has sort of long-term plans with BRICS, or is it merely a sort of stepping stone towards, I can see everything is very fluid, obviously, and Trump's victory will also make this, a difficult, there's probably not a path forward, but do you think that BRICS will still be here in 20, 30 years' time, or is it a sort of stepping stone for China on the way to become a global imperialist main power?
Shall I answer now? Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah. I think this Belt and Road initiative, which is linked to BRICS, I know they share the same initials, accidentally, I think, nothing to do with BRICS, but BRI, as China keeps calling it, is essential for China. And what it's trying to do is long-term with that. So it is aware, for example, in terms of electric cars, it is well aware that the cheapest raw material it can get in Africa is best served through Belt and Road. Now, what better way than to make the Belt and Road part of BRICS strategy? So BRICS strategy wants to get all of these involved. And I think for that reason, I think for China, BRICS is not a short-term policy. For some of the countries within BRICS, Yes, it is. And it might change with political changes. For example, as you know, Argentina left after the last elections, right? So you can see that maybe a change of power in India, that can happen. It's not guaranteed, it can happen, might change that position. But for China, BRICS is significant. And if you look, there's a drawing, I couldn't do it, but there's a drawing that shows trade between these countries and then trade with China. And it basically, it's the whole screen is black with connections between these countries and China. And then there's the odd line between these countries as they trade with each other. So you could say China is central to BRICS. And for those reasons, I think it would last. But as you rightly say, in the New World Order, with Trump coming to power, with, I don't know, wars happening all over the place, it's very difficult to predict. But I would say, yes, for China, BRICS is important. Some countries might leave. There is apparently a real drive by the US, especially by Trump, to try and get Saudi Arabia and UAE to leave. So presents, offers, loans, everything is being put forward. The question remains that some of these countries might not go that way, might not be bought by US, not because they have any principles, but because they are scared of their own population. So as Crown Prince bin Salman has openly admitted in an interview, he couldn't care less about Palestinians, right? He's openly said it. I think it's to Bloom, I'm not sure who, but he said, I don't care. However, my people do, and I can't ignore it. So in a world where tensions are increasing, in a world where wars are dividing people so strongly, I think some of these countries might decide there is some advantage in being in BRICS, but who knows?
Can I ask you one more question before we bring comrades from the floor in? The question of Taiwan, I mean, that's been brewing for some time, and it's been occasionally artificially blown up, then it dies down again. Do you expect with Trump's victory, this will come to blows? That the question of Taiwan is hugely important to the US, to the West. Will there be a proxy war, another proxy war being fought there?
I really don't know, to be honest, too much about. I can't predict. More importantly, I can't predict what Trump will do, because on paper he says he is for weakening China, defeating China. That's the way US will become the great power and that it was, or I would say it still is, whatever damages it has faced. The question remains, will he go that way? I would say Trump and his administration are more likely to go for these tariffs that he's promising, rather than choose the Taiwan option. So there's two ways of attacking China. One is Taiwan, as you say, recognize Taiwan or whatever, and create another war, proxy war, or try and reduce China's power by tariffs. Now, as everyone keeps saying, the 60% proposed tariff, I mean, he hasn't said it since he's been elected, but during the election, he was talking of 60% tariff on Chinese imports, right? I mean, this would create the kind of economic crisis in US that would be comparable to the Truss mini budget, yeah? The quasi-Quante and Truss mini budget. As most US producers would tell you, if that happens, they will go bankrupt. Never mind the Chinese. They would go bankrupt because suddenly if you produce the same good in US, you would be paying about 4 or 5 times more. So the tariff would become a joke. So it's very difficult to predict, and I really don't know. But I would say he's still more keen to go on the economic route than the Taiwan route, but who knows?
Yeah, indeed. Thanks, Yasmin. John.
Thank you very much, Tina. Thank you, Yasmin. I just want to make a number of points drawn from a book I'm currently reading by Zach Cope, The Wealth of Nations, and also a couple of things I've seen on the internet. And the first point is that taken together now, Saudi Arabia is part of BRICS. And Iran is part of BRICS and Venezuela is part of BRICS. I think the current figure for the proportion of the world's oil that BRICS is responsible for is something like 43, 44%. Now, that is highly significant strategically and politically. Not just for China, not just for the US, but for the whole world. If we think back to the 1970s, there were two major hikes through OPEC at the time in the price of oil, which produced a crisis in capitalist profitability. And as a result of that crisis, the post-war settlement of welfare states and all the rest was thrown out, and neoliberalism was brought in. And so it produced a very great change in the capitalist system and in the imperialist world order as well at the time. And that, of course, was provoked over Israel's attacks on Arab states in relation to Palestine. So it's not inconceivable to me that oil could be used by BRICS in an emergency situation or in an economically or politically important situation. And that might be an important situation for BRICS as a whole, or for Russia or China or India or any bloc within BRICS. Secondly, there are something like, I think, 9 full members and 13 additional countries that have been at the last BRICS Congress in Kazakhstan were invited to actually apply for membership. That would make them bigger than the G20 in terms of numerical strength. And given what Yasmin has said, and which I've read about, that the rate of interest rates, in fact, the extent really of unequal trading between imperialist powers and the global South is far less. So BRICS becomes, in that case, a much more attractive option for a lot of countries in South America, in Africa, in Asia, in the global South generally, who can see perhaps marginal differences. And I think this can continue as well because of the reason that for the US and for Europe, I think that the extraction of surplus profits, of super profits from the global South, where labor is considerably cheaper than it is in the capitalist heartlands, enables it to cushion the effect of its own crises and ride out its own crises in relation particularly to the working class in the advanced capitalist countries. Now, it needs, therefore, if it's going to keep the working class on side, it has to maintain those kind of level of profit margins from the global South. Therefore, I can conceive, not immediately, maybe not for a decade or decades, but Western capitalism could be squeezed suddenly through the use of oil and or long term because lots of African countries, Asian countries, Latin American countries are choosing the Chinese option rather than the World Bank, IMF, Bretton Woods options with all the structural adjustment policies and the various repression and the, what is it now, 86 American military bases around the world. So I think I'm slightly more optimistic about the future and about BRICS' role in it than Yassamine is. But it's a debate, and nobody's got all the answers. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Do you want to reply? Yes, please.
I'll just say a few things. I mean, obviously, it's very difficult to predict future, but in terms of oil, if I understand correctly from what other people tell me, US is now independent of oil imports. It's self-sufficient. It has shale, it's got other things. It's oil. The dependence of oil remains in the European countries and the rest of the world. But as far as the US is concerned, especially in the Trump era, a weakness of European countries would be an advantage rather than a disadvantage. So the US is not concerned about that. In fact, others have argued that there could have been, and there still is a chance, that the EU might find interest in uniting with China. Some people used to build quite a lot of theories about this. I don't think some, including some of my own comrades, but I think that was wrong and proved to be wrong. But irrespective of that, I think the US will not be too concerned about EU dependence on oil. They couldn't care less when Russian oil to Germany stopped and increased prices. So I think that's a debatable issue. And here, as we get into a period of serious competition between two major economic powers, US and China, we can witness a situation where the EU will and UK will become pawns in that game. They become if you like, areas where neither US cares about them and China can benefit or not. In terms of it being an attractive option, I will give you a historic example. Throughout the oil nationalization saga in Iran in 1952-53, Mossadegh, who was the nationalist oil, the nationalist man, the man who wanted to nationalize oil, who had identified correctly the British oil company as an exploiter remnants of colonial era, considered the US to be progressive. In fact, part of his downfall was that he was so keen on keeping US on his side that he was often repressive on Tudeh and the communists. So I have my own problems with Tudeh, but it is true that Mossadegh did repress Tudeh because he wanted to look better to US, and he had serious illusions about US. And exactly as China, US, in its rise to this imperialist hegemon power situation, was giving much better rates, was very attractive to many countries in the third world. As I tried to point out, and Tina said as well, the US was the champion of constructive development. It talked of constructive development. Its destructive period did not come about because oil prices went up. It came about in the 1970s because of crises of capitalism and the rise of neoliberal economic policies. And when we reached that stage, then it became the nasty hegemon power that seek destruction rather than construction. And I would argue that no one who knows the Chinese Communist Party, and I have some knowledge of the Chinese Communist Party, I have studied it a bit more than many people have, but I'm not an expert, but I have studied the inner workings of the Chinese Communist Party for at least 2 decades. I would argue that China, rising to become the hegemon capitalist power, would show the kind of ruthlessness, the kind of exploitation we have not seen ever before, because the stakes will be higher, the problems will be more difficult, and China will show itself to be exactly what any power wanting to become the world hegemon will show. But I might be proved wrong. I think in critique we are more or less united in this opinion, but maybe we are wrong.
Thank you. Well, it's certainly the way it treats its own working class is a good hint there. Peter, please.
Hi there. Can you hear me? Hi, Yasmin. Thanks for the talk. I think what you've done was provide a really detailed and nuanced account of the pragmatism within BRICS. Between themselves, between the different parts of BRICS, the Brazil, India, China, and the BRIC Plus countries as well. I was wondering whether you think this pragmatism can lead to anything more consolidated. Obviously, you just said then that China is going to pop up as the world hegemon at some point. That's the kind of prediction. And it's going to be even more oppressive than America, perhaps, or in a different way. So that means that maybe China is using BRICS as you mentioned yourself, is kind of using BRICS in a pragmatic way to kind of buffer relations with the US in the ways that you described, while building up alliances and trade alliances and building up economic strength along the way. Okay. What interests me though is, like, when you say that there can be a shift in hegemon, how do we relate this to trade and commerce and money in terms of capital? So when we talk about, we are talking about capitalism, and so what does unite all the pragmatisms and the differences between these nations and between imperialist and sub-imperialist powers that you've described tonight is that they are or want to be the core of capitalism, the part of capitalism. So that means that, like, the basis of imperialism at its heart is to expand capital and control that capital in the expansion worldwide, so you get the major share of surplus value. But as you mentioned yourself, there's been a turn towards neoliberalism, globalization, and those terms, which underpinning them in terms of capital and how it's expanded, seems to me to have come to an end with neoliberalism. And that was based on a kind of like a pragmatic use of IT. And in other words, not advancing towards the latest and the integration of the latest forms of IT, which could be labor displacement and have a downward trend in the rate of profit, even more so than is in the West at the moment. That would affect the globe. And an intense exploitation of labor instead. And the global supply of labor from China into the world market and the redefinition of the global division of labor serve that purpose, along with all the talk about precarity. That's a signal for that as well, whether you agree with these sexy terms like precarity, it signals that. So that seems to have come to an end. So any kind of advance, serious qualitative advance in any of these like proto-imperialist powers, including China, has got to come from the hope that they can kind of overcome the pincer movement of squeezing labour so intently. That seems to have come to an end to a large extent, and trying to deal with the other side of that pincer, which is about the rate of profit and how that ties into increasing technology and which underpins growth, if that's labour displacement, if you know what I mean. So to me, all this points to a kind of a long-term trend in the squeezing of the jaws of the kind of avenues of accumulation globally for capital as a global system, economic system, and not political. And I think the US is managing that militarily in terms of its money power and policing the rest of the world, and dictating the kind of accumulation strategy that fits into the crisis tendencies of capital, limit them. So any imperial. So my question is this: do you agree with it or what? That if we are going to get any real advance, it's going to be based on a new pathway of accumulation, and that will have dealt with the realization problem, which is produced by the intensification of labour, the cheapening of labour, so that many states are supporting incomes of labour because capital is paying it so at such a low rate, below its value at times. And it's got to be a method of being able to incorporate constant capital, fixed capital, technology to increase the productive powers of labour. And I'm wondering whether you think that is possible, whether we live in a decline in capitalism, in which case, if we do have imperialism, is any longer the kind of classic capitalist imperialism, and it looks more like a kind of imperialism that takes all the bad parts of all the imperialisms that we've had since Rome, stitches them together, and that's why it's going to be grotesque in China, in the kind of face of imperialism that China may represent, which to me would be non-capitalist, And the other interesting thing, just one thing, is that if China were to dominate, and then it's doing so on the hyper-monopolization of the economy and the state's fusion with the economy. And so that seems to be out of kilter a bit with the way the Western powers would have done it. So it seems to be a different kind of capitalism that might come into favor if things change in that direction. Okay, that's all I want to say.
Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, very important issues. I think you pointed out this whole transition of hegemon power, and this is really the main challenge for China, because being a hegemon power is not just how advanced you are in terms of capitalism, whether you are the second largest economy, you are growing, and so on. To become the hegemon power, you have to have the dominant global currency, and China hasn't got that. This whole yuanization is part of it, but it still is very limited. It still is people who are desperate, like Iran and Russia doing yuan, but does anybody else use Chinese currency for its economy? No. And the Chinese central bank's attempts at making the currency more part of, if you like, a central part of BRICS hasn't worked. So far, it hasn't worked. I mean, Brazil deals in dollars. India deals in dollars. The currency dominant in the world remains the dollar. So that's a bit of a problem. The second issue is what you also alluded to, and that is military, you talked about, was military might. Now, historically, people talked in the old colonial era of the strength of the Navy. Then it became the issue of the Air Force. Of course, now we are looking at all these new weaponry, drones, artificial intelligence, but the Air Force still remains quite important. And here again, China has made major progress, but it's not, especially in terms of space technology, it is lacking. Yeah? What it tries to make up for is in artificial intelligence. And here I think it probably has reached the US. If you work in an institution like where I am, everyone is obsessed about protecting artificial intelligence. Oh, Chinese are trying to steal our intellectual property. To be honest, I don't think so. I think the Chinese are ahead of the University of Oxford, but maybe I'm wrong, but I think from what I read and from what experts in the field tell me, they've passed that stage. But it does remain the fact that militarily they are lacking. And there is also the nuclear issue. And here again, the combined forces of China and Russia in terms of nuclear might is probably parallel to US, maybe slightly less, but there again, there isn't a clear balance. The problem is that in terms of the decline in capitalism, that is the crucial issue. And that is that China is facing economic issues. China is facing, if you like, a ceiling in terms of growth. All the countries are facing this problem. And precisely because of that, it is a reflection of the decline of an order. It's not the decline of a particular capitalism, the US capitalism. It is more global than that. And precisely because of that, I don't think we should put any hope in Chinese capitalism saving the world, as opposed to US capitalism destroying the world. They are both destructive in the long term. And it is because of that one could argue the future is barbarism of socialism. We are not looking at a in-between way where China, with some reform, will improve the situation and delay the decline of capitalism. We are facing very, very clear and very stark conditions. I want to add one last point, and that's partly because this issue of interest rates and China not charging as high an interest rate, it's maybe half at times compared to Western capital. Well, the higher rates that the World Bank and the IMF are charging are really irrelevant because these countries are so poor, they're so much in debt, they can't return these rates, right? So China has opted for a far more realistic rate because at least it gets its money back. It's actually financially more astute to have an interest rate where people can afford to return you the loan, as opposed to a kind of interest rate that is astronomical. No one will ever be able to pay what IMF or the World Bank is charging. So there are some who would argue, okay, is China being very generous to these poor third world countries? And some who would argue, no, it's actually very clever banking strategy by China to charge these lower interest rates.
Thank you. Una.
Hi, good evening, Yasmin, and thank you very much. Now, I'm going to ask you a very easy, simple, not erudite question. In view of the new American government, Trump and his weirdo of government, how is America going to fare in the world? Because we have a bunch of idiots, and that's very worrying.
Yasmin, I'm going to ask you a couple of more questions from the chat, if that's okay. Tim asked a little while ago, there is BRICS now has got its own bank based in China, headed by Dilma Rousseff. Is that already working? And does it enable countries under heavy US sanctions to trade freely and import goods that they currently can't get hold of? Also, John asked about the currency they were discussing, which a joint BRICS currency, not the yuan. I think they were thinking about a different currency. Has there been any development on that front? Thank you.
Okay, I'll start with the third ones. And the joint BRICS currency would need a backer, right? So yes, they are talking of a new currency, but the financial, if you like, the strength of that currency has to rely on one economy, and it's not going to rely on Brazil's economy as good as, well, it's slightly better than some countries, but still very weak. So it's not going to rely on, it's going to be China and to a lesser extent India, because all these other countries are really economically very weak. China is the dominant, India is the second. So the new currency, the joint BRICS currency proposed by various people, it will not be called yuan, but in my opinion would still be very much dependent on China's economy. But yes, they can. And in terms of political, if you like, publicity, it would be very advantageous for them, because then they can say, look, the US is imposing the dollar on its allies. We are not, it's all to do with the way this Belt and Road presents itself. You know, we are into cooperation. We are into working together. We are all equal, right? China goes to a poor African country and says, you and I, your country and my country are equal. And then it sends 5,000 Chinese experts to a country where the literacy rate is very low, never mind expertise in construction and development. And those 5,000, I mean, I know the 5,000 because it's a particular country that I've been back, but you know, they're going to stay for 20 years in that place, right? And okay, on the surface, you would say, yes, this is going to be equal partners. The reality will be that the experts will dominate everything to do with the economy or the construction and development of that country. So, as I say, they are presenting all this in a very positive way, but we should look at it beyond what is the presentation. And yes, the new BRICS currency will look better than saying yuanization or ruble just becoming dependent. The banks have helped. The problem is that, for example, if you look at an economy like Iran, despite the fact that, okay, the BRICS banks and the Chinese banks have helped circumvent a large number of sanctions, and I believe the same is true in Russia. There are many goods you can only, at the moment, you can only buy from the West. Peter Nolan, who is an expert on China, is very good at explaining how China's economy has developed. And he rightly points out that they have the highest technology in terms of GP, graphical processor units, computing processor units. They build all sorts of very advanced systems, and yet the lifts have to come. You go to a building in China housing one of the most advanced technologies in terms of IT, and the lifts have to come from Germany, right? So this unequal development, which is inevitable when a country progresses dramatically in a very short period of time, you would have this kind of disparity. But precisely because of that, I don't know about Russia, but for example, in Iran, there are a lot of goods that can only be bought from Europe, right? So however much you try and sell your oil with the Chinese banks and get a lower price for it, because inevitably you're selling it almost under the table, you have to buy goods then from Germany, from France, from Italy. You have to buy spare parts for your planes, for your hospitals, for your medical equipment from the West. And so you can't circumvent entirely trade and use just the yuan and the Chinese bank. You can earn funds from that. You can hide many items you sell with that yuan currency, but there are still things you have to buy. And so I would say, yes, without the BRICS bank situation might have been even worse. I don't know what the exchange rate would have been between the dollar and the Iranian currency or the ruble, but it's not dominant. In terms of what Una asks, the Trump government is completely mad, but remember that his previous government was also mad, right? Some of these people might not last very long. I mean, the Attorney General lasted, what, 5 days, 4 days before he was removed. So, and he was removed because of the various sad stories about him, terrible stories about him. But Trump himself is going to fall out with many of these people. And when he falls out, that's it, they all go. So we're going to see a lot of, in my opinion, we're going to see a lot of people coming and going. Look what's happened to Giuliani. You know, he was the lawyer of Trump, best mate. Now he's nowhere. I think some of these people, I'm looking forward to the day where Elon Musk and Trump fall out and we will all have a good laugh at what's going on. It's all very unpredictable, but remember that these states also have a lot of other, like the State Department has professionals who will make the thing run. There'll be all sorts of other ways in which the current US establishment will remain in control without being in power. And we'll see quite a lot of that. So we will have unbelievably stupid things said and done. Don't take me wrong. I'm looking forward to a lot of those. But having said that, there will be some continuity in terms of everything, including Ukraine, including definitely Gaza, where the new administration will present slogans that appear different. I mean, in terms of Gaza, it's worse than, even worse than Biden, genocide Joe and genocide Kamala. But in terms of Ukraine, they might present different words and so on. But it won't be immediate dramatic change. But I could be wrong. I'm just speculating here. Thank you.
Thanks, Yasmin. Last person from the floor is Matthew.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Yasmin. I think, well, Matt Gaetz, of course, as the Attorney General, the reason why he was blown out was, of course, he was in Congress until the day he was nominated. He'd spent a lot of his time in Congress insulting everybody around him, including all the senators who'd have to vote for him. So they all said, "No chance, not that guy." You know, that wasn't they didn't really object to the fact that he had all these outstanding, legal issues. I mean, so does Trump. But I mean, they really objected to be insulted by him. But they are, these things, as you say, these things will all come out in the wash. But I think, and it is a facet of the decay of the system. actual decay of the American system, that it's run by a bunch of nakedly corrupt bought operatives who are just irrational, actually. I mean, if you look at the Supreme Court, I mean, it's infested with these people who just openly, they just take money. You can buy them, and so on. The system operates like that. But the thing is, I think that in terms of the situation as it looks at the moment, I mean, China, of course, is used to have a very close relationship with the US. I mean, Nixon, who may have been a crook, but was a smart crook, actually, of course, did a deal with the Chinese in the early 70s. And there was a close relationship. I mean, going through, the Chinese supported all the repressive things America did all around the world. Famously the coup in Chile and all the rest of it, and through the 80s and so on. And there was an exchange, obviously an exchange. I mean, you read the stuff, and there was clearly a very close intellectual exchange between the top end of the American state machine and the Chinese for at least 2.5 decades, and it would be interesting to see what the fallout was, because clearly there is the fallout really is based on the fact that the Americans were terrified of the rise of China. I mean, China, of course, until actually, the last 25 years was economically more or less irrelevant, but it's that huge growth, isn't it? And it's the fact that, I mean, China may have, it's not a fully capitalist system. I mean, obviously it has billionaires and various of the expressions of capitalism, but it's not, it still has state direction. And actually, of course, the whole economic crash of 0708, it was the Chinese that bailed out the world system by instituting this vast building program, pouring more cement than had ever been seen in human history, in order to, the classic function of Stalinism, which is to bail out capitalism. So in those terms, but as you say, I mean, the other thing is, of course, in terms of the US method of control of the world is also disintegrating, as we can see quite clearly. I mean, the effect in Gaza, and the fact that they're actually sort of blowing through all their own establishments. The fact that they've set all these things up, the UN, all these different institutions, and they're just blowing them away, destroying them in the eyes of either actually in terms of the structure or in terms of the estimation of the rest of the world. People can see that actually now, of course, we're ruled by monsters. Clearly, who are in favour of the most barbaric acts, nakedly. So, but as you also say, I mean, there's this contradiction. I think the problem, there's an issue for the Americans, obviously, in the fact that their system is actually falling apart in their hands, and you can see this very clearly in the case of banks. The collapse of Silicon Valley Bank actually showed, clearly that the banks are all welded together in a single organism. Which cannot be touched because they're too afraid to touch it, because they know it's going to blow apart. If they mess around with it, it's going to blow apart. So what they did with Silicon Valley Bank, and I think there were the two other banks that collapsed. We saw, one of the most major financial collapses in American history. Of course, it wasn't actually, and nobody actually said this. We just said, well, some banks have collapsed, and we fixed it. What they actually did was pump a load of money into these banks and chop them up and give them away. And say, well, the system can carry on, and the same, of course, with Credit Suisse, which also collapsed at the same time. They actually, what they did, of course, was the other way around. Of course, it was to keep the Saudis sweet by destroying the bondholders and keeping the shareholders whole, because the shareholders happen to be Saudis. So it's quite clear that system itself is on the point of collapse. The other interesting thing in terms of has been that process also. Part of that process of the growth of China was a deliberate export of industry. I mean, in Europe, actually, they spent, certainly here and in other countries, they actually exported entire factories. They just physically moved them to China. Because obviously they didn't want the bother of manufacturing the stuff here, so they just get the Chinese to do it. And so what you then also had was a situation in which there was a certain amount of substitution of labour for machine, but that's now gone the other way, in the fact that China, as you say, actually dominates now, has a domination of certain certain elements of the world economy. The Americans recently started taking apart Chinese electric vehicles, and the American Ford and so on couldn't understand how these things were put together. They couldn't understand the technology. They just didn't have they just didn't have it. So I mean, that's why they start sticking tariffs on these things, because they're terrified, because they just can't make anything equivalent. At the same time, and obviously China then also, of course, dominates the all rare earth minerals. Virtually all the lithium in the world is processed in China. Lithium batteries, I mean, the Europeans have desperately tried to produce a battery manufacturer of some standing, and they can't. All the batteries come out of China. And you've then got this issue, and I think 80% of all PV solar panels come out of China. Nobody else can make them at anything like on anything like the basis. So actually, in those terms, as you say, the economy, one, of course, very, very difficult to section up the economy into autarkic bits now. You can't, it's just physically impossible, as Trump is going to find out again. And also, of course, that bits of it are heavily dominated by the Chinese, which, I mean, obviously is frightening the hell out of the rest of the world. And really, the issue the Chinese, of course, have got is the fact that they've got this vast great, in having poured all this concrete, they now have a vast great property empire, much of which, of course, is worthless, and which they owe large amounts of money on, and their companies are falling apart. And how do they bail themselves out? So the system itself is actually dropping, the bits are dropping off. But the key, the problem really, of course, is that the working class isn't on the stage anywhere. This is the political problem, is how does the working class express itself and get through the whole of this stuff, because clearly none of this is going to pose any kind of answer to the crisis of humanity. I hope that made sense.
Thank you, Matthew. Yasmin, do you want to reply, sum up the session as well in your reply now? Thank you.
Just a few things. Yeah, I think it's quite clear that the party in China, the still called the Communist Party, dominates the economy, the politics, the military. And during various times, and especially in recent years, we have seen this unbelievable rise of the Chinese middle class, I would say upper class, capitalist owning class, who can actually buy things abroad as well as being very powerful inside China. But they are all, and I would argue maybe capitalists all over the world are controlled by their political, or work with their political masters. But in China, you can't diss the political master. So even if you own a major company, you can be arrested, you can be, put in prison, or all your wealth could be taken from you. And in that level, you can say that the state is very much more in control of the economy, of politics, of everything than in the West. But otherwise, this whole concept that the West goes on about liberal value, Western values, rule of law, international law, adhering to principles of human rights and so on, is all, for the majority of the world, not just the left, has become a serious joke. It really is joke when you've got, Genocide Joe defending Israel. No one takes it seriously. So that pretense of the West has actually helped the collapse of that pretense of the West has helped the Chinese, has helped the Russians, there is no doubt, and therefore has helped the BRICS. The problem is that no one then looked at how China deals with its own capital. Never mind, Tina referred to the working class, which is true. I mean, it's one of the most exploitative rules in terms of labor legislation. I sometimes read China labor reports, and it's horrifying when you read what they say. But they're not even tolerating their capitalists. I mean, capitalists are very much under the control of the state. So in that way, I think unless we have a revolution against all capitalism, against both of these causes, we are deluding ourselves into one helping us achieve a revolutionary aim. It's not going to happen like that. In terms of what the West fears, so for decades, if you remember, the accusation was that, especially when it came to iPhone, computers, laptops, desktops, servers, and so on, China was copying and pasting. So it was copying what the West had and creating its own version in the same way that you would copy and paste a document. This has changed, and it has changed dramatically, as Matthew was referring to. So we've got a situation where it's not just that electric vehicles built in China are cheaper, they're actually better. So why would you buy a much more expensive, worse Tesla when you can buy a cheaper, better one from China? And unless they have, everyone now has put these almost embargoes on Chinese electric vehicles because they can't compete. So yes, that's one serious issue. And the other one is whether it's true or not, whether we believe it or not, the hype about artificial intelligence is now dominating capitalism, right? So every company is investing in AI, every company is projecting its future in terms of AI. Now, AI depends very much on not your normal computer units because they are slow, like the laptops we are all using, but on something called graphical processor units, GPUs. NVIDIA has made its fortune in the world by selling graphical processor units. It's one of the, I don't know if you follow the top 500 companies, that's what it is. You know, NVIDIA is the top company and it's growing. It had a few dips in the last couple of weeks, but in general, it's dominating because it creates the chip that is essential for AI. Without trying to give too many secrets away, an institution I work with was trying to buy graphical processor units and compared the performance of NVIDIA with Chinese-made real Chinese, because NVIDIA also makes their chips in China because it's cheaper, but then it comes via other countries. And the performance of the Chinese graphical processor units is better, right? So it's no longer cut and paste. They have done the cut and paste. Now they are actually ahead. Something that never happened with Russia. I mean, I've been reading critiques, old articles, because we published the 100th issue. So in the 100th issue, we republished articles from issue 1. And yes, exactly. And it just reminded me of how, you know, when Hilal was doing all that work about Russia, he rightly pointed out their economic backwardness, their technological weakness, the fact that they were technologically so far back that they could never compete in what they had foreseen. Well, we are talking of a different situation. But unlike those days, I think we are in a different world. We are not looking at two counts. And it's easy for people with nostalgia for the two camps era to see China and the BRICS and the China-Russia alliance as, oh, well, this is the socialist camp, but this socialist camp can actually win. No, comrades. If this one wins, it's going to be a worse, more aggressive, kind of, I don't know, horrible. I think Peter used the word horrible. I would say horrible capitalist system. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. Thank you, everybody, for a really interesting discussion, good questions, good contribution. So we all enjoyed that, I think. Next week, we'll be taking a look at the Soviet women's movement and ask the questions, were they feminists? Should we be feminists? Is the second question. So another interesting session in our Communist Culture Club. See you next week, hopefully. Thank you, Yasmin.
Thanks very much, Tina.
Bye, comrades.
Thank you.